Okay, amazing. My name is Esther Sperber. I'm one of the organizers of Smolemuni US, a group of Orthodox and observant people who feel a deep connection to Israel and feel very concerned about some of the things happening there, feel like our Judaism has been perverted by voices that we don't recognize, and trying to affect our own communities, and in doing so also help make changes on the ground in Israel. We are very, very, very pleased to have Mikhael Manekin here, founder of Smolemuni in Israel and a whole constellation of organizations that live under that name, doing a kind of array of grassroots political activism, also deeply rooted in Jewish values. And I don't want to say too much because Mikhael is going to talk about his work. I also want to acknowledge that in this last week, we've had 5 different events, which is a little bit insane. There was a last minute trip that the New Israel Fund organized for some of the activists from Bnei Avraham who do protective presence in the West Bank. And so as soon as we heard that they were coming and Mikhael was going to be here, we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to hear from them. So we had an event that NIF organized in Brooklyn last week, and then we had a picnic on Shabbat afternoon with Roy Kleitman, and there was another smaller event here on Sunday, and a Zoom with 3 activists from Bnei Avraham on Monday, and today we have Mikhael. So we're really moved that there are any people who are still willing to come and hear from us. We have a little minhag, a custom of starting with a very, very short Dvar Torah. And I was thinking about the parasha this week. We're reading Korach in Israel. You read it last week. You're way ahead of us. And after Korach and his people have a mini revolt, and Moshe speaks to God. God wants to kill everyone, and Moshe says, and I should open my phone and find the pasuk, but Moshe says, why are you going to kill all of them for one person's sin? And Rashi says that God listens, and really the only ones who are punished are the people who sinned. And I think we live at a time in which we have gotten too complacent with situations in which all kinds of people are seen as collateral damage for sins of other people. And that's true in wars in the political sphere. It's also true with kind of the non-discriminate way that ICE is working on our streets, and remembering that Moshe kind of reminded Hashem to focus on each person and that each life is valuable is something that we can hold on to. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand on the microphone to Mikhael. Mikhael is going to talk a little, and then maybe I'll ask some questions, and maybe some people from the audience can ask some questions.
Sounds okay. Hi. I think what I'm gonna do is give a whole bunch of introductions, and then that'll be it. Like, I'll explain a bit about what Smolemuni is up to in Israel, why our focus is what our focus is. I've been here. I arrived here on Sunday, and I'm leaving tomorrow. And it's been really interesting these last couple of days because I've been meeting with a lot of sort of partners abroad, and I find that a lot of times the conversation is very, very different, which makes sense. You guys are looking at things from a different perspective and a different point of view. So what I'd really like to do is present sort of the point of view of where I'm coming from, and just what it's like, at least for us to be Israeli activists at this moment, why Smolemuni is growing so much in the last year or two in Israel, or at least why I think, and sort of what is the perhaps like the theological dimensions that are interesting to us currently. So that's what I'm going to do, if that's okay. And if it comes out dry, I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure It'll be fine. And then in the Q&A, we can maybe get into things that interest you. I don't know what interests you. Maybe other things interest you. So first, just by way of introduction, my name is Mikhael. I'm 47. I live in Jerusalem with my wife Yael, who teaches Yiddish at Hebrew U. And we have 3 children. Ruth, who is currently doing a gap year program after high school in Israel, getting drafted probably in a couple of months. Sarai, who's in 9th grade, and Noach, who's in 5th grade. That's most of who I am. I also do Smol Emuni stuff. I've really been involved in, I would say, call it like anti-occupation activism, or any activism in the relationship between Jews and Palestinians, either in 67 or 48, over the last 20-some years. Was involved in breaking the silence in the beginning, and then ran the organization for a bunch of years, and then was involved in a think tank called Molad, which I ran. Over the last 10 years, I've also been running a fellowship program called the Alliance Fellowship, which does work with political leadership on the left in Israel, Jewish and Palestinian, from various different parties and organizations and affiliations. And in the last almost 4 years, because we started right after the election, and we're almost done with that, 4 years in November, I've been running the Smol Emuni with a bunch of other friends of mine. Smol Emuni is not an NGO. It's not an organization. It's really a, we say in Israel, zerem. I guess it would be like, movement or stream, or basically an identity of a group of people that functions in various different ways. It started from the perspective of people who come from different types of religious communities in Israel, be it people who come from religious Zionist communities, or people who come from ultra-Orthodox communities, people who come from what we call in Israel Masorti communities, which means there's something different than in this country. Increasingly, but though there's also an appeal to secular Israelis who are joining. We really started out of the understanding that when the last government was elected, that it's both the most right-wing government that Israel ever had, and it's also the most religious government that Israel has ever had, and those are still very much intertwined with each other. We felt a degree of loneliness, I guess, both in terms of our own sort of sociological communities, but also in terms of our political communities, because sort of the religious dimension is perceived as such a threat in the country that even if you're in a religious alternative, you're still perceived in a lot of liberal left circles as, I don't know if necessarily part of the problem, but at least an outlier which doesn't represent the community as it should be. That was 4 years ago. It started off as a conference, but I think as time has developed, I think the most major significant event was the 7th of October and then Gaza. And I think really the Smol Emuni developed really in response and in conversation with Gaza, and of course Lebanon, the West Bank, Iran, and so on. I don't know how many of you have been in Israel in the last couple of years. It's really a different place in the sense that I think even for me, even for like the basic sense of understanding time, and it's very hard for me to remember what was a year ago and what was a year and a half ago. Everybody knows people who have been hurt. There's a lot of confusion. I think like as a parent, forget politics for a second. There's a lot of confusion in sort of just how things function. I think of my kids, it's suddenly they're off 2 months for school because of Iran. Suddenly they're back. Every day there's some sort of like very violent something happening in the area. And I think it's very much sort of already ingrained in the psyche of a lot of Israelis. And I think Smol Emuni is really developing in light of that. Obviously, there's a theological dimension to a lot of what's happening now in the country. The way we talk about war, the way the government talks about war, is deeply tied to questions of the land of Israel, to questions of anti-Semitism, to questions of how do we treat goyim, the question of what does vengeance look like, what does war look like, what is how should a Jewish person behave. All of those are being articulated and re-articulated in light of sort of the violence around us. And I think it's really changing a lot of how Israeli society perceives itself, and how it perceives its Jewish understanding of itself. That's not to say that this is a crisis of sort of, I think a lot of times people, when we talk about Israel, we talk about sort of like religious Zionists as sort of like taking over the country against its understanding of itself. I don't think that's what's happening. I think the challenges which we face today in Israel, theologically and ethically, are ingrained in the political project of Israeliness. I just don't want to say Zionism, of Israeliness since before 48. And it's just that the most perhaps extreme articulators of the problem of that, in my understanding, is sort of the religious Zionist world. But a lot of what we're trying to figure out is with ourselves is, what does it mean to be a Jewish person who's committed to our tradition, as a human being, as an ethical individual, as a community, and so on. And we'll talk a bit about that today. Maybe I'll just say also so that's one introduction. Another introduction would be, at the Smol Emuni currently is like 5 groups or organizations. The first, which has been getting some attention in the last couple of months in Israel, and has been growing quite rapidly, is a project called Bnei Avraham. Bnei Avraham actually predates Smol Emuni. I had the good fortune of being in Bnei Avraham in the mid-2000s, but really sort of picked up around the start of Smol Emuni. It's what is called today protective presence. Maybe I'll say a bit of what that means. But Bnei Avraham has really grown in the last year in terms of our activists. So there are currently, I think, roughly around 180 sort of young Israeli activists who are involved regularly in what's called protective presence. What that means is there's currently an incredible, as I'm sure all of you know, there's incredible violence in the West Bank. It started before the 7th of October, really picked up immediately after the 7th of October. That means that Palestinians living in Area C are subjected to daily violence by, the name changes, but I would say Israelis. Israelis who can either be settlers or citizen soldiers or police, but it's basically a whole system which is making their life incredibly miserable. When I say incredibly miserable, it's anywhere from scaring children, cutting trees, killing, stealing of land, things happening on really on a daily level all over the territories. Bnei Avraham really started picking up, I would say, a year and a half ago, started doing full Shabbatot of protective presence. So we go and we keep Shabbat, but in an area that's affected by violence, and protect when we can. We started in Ras El Ain. Ras El Ain is a village which no longer exists. They moved out because of so much violence directed towards the community. Today we're working in 10 areas, primarily between Bethlehem and Hebron region. A lot of what we do is work with farmers who are trying to get back to their land, can't go back to their land without, or it's, I'm trying to sort of word it exactly, are only able to go back to their land sometimes when Israelis escort them. So that is the role of Bnei Avraham. And that's growing, but that's only one of their projects. On the very other end of the spectrum, we have a complete separate organization called Hasadeh, which does educational work in official capacity. So work with teachers primarily in religious Zionist schools or in Haredi schools, particularly something called the Mamach, which are Haredi schools that works through state infrastructure. We have a gap year program starting next year. We have around 150 teachers that we work with. We have curriculum that we're projecting and so on. So that's a completely other project. In the middle of that, we have a publishing house. We've put out 5 books so far. Some of them books by rabbis who wrote a century ago. It could be Rabbi Yael, or we just put out a book last week by Rav Ben Amozeg, who wrote in the late 19th, early 20th century. We think is relevant for things happening today, but also sort of current work in political theology. We have 2 books coming up in the next couple of months. We'd also just published a journal, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which focuses also on political theology in terms of what we're trying to create. And lastly, we have a project called the Midrasha, which is an immersive political education program for young adults. We have roughly 100 alumni so far. We started the project around a year and a half ago. So things are really picking up. It's weird also when you get out of the country, or also when you're in the country and everybody's really depressed. And I empathize and sympathize, and sometimes I'm depressed myself. But from an organizational perspective, things are developing very rapidly. I think part of that has to do with the fact that because there's such a clear relationship between what's happening on the ground in the last 4 years and conversations about what it means to be a Jew. So I think there's a real thirst or need for people to articulate a response on the Jewish front and not only on the secular national liberal front. I think there's an understanding for many people that this thing that's happening in the country is very tied to a lot of deeply ingrained self-understandings of Jewry. And I think a lot of what Jews feel, both in Israel, around the world, who are critical of that, is confusion, because we have these parts of our identity which are perhaps challenging in light of what happens when Jews have power. And I think a lot of what we're trying to figure out is how to deal with that. So that's introduction number 2. The last introduction will be, what does that actually mean from like a Jewish perspective, from a theological perspective? What does it mean to think about a Torah which is done differently? I will say that the tradition that we are part of in the Smol Emuni is what I would call rabbinic traditional to an extent, meaning most of us grew in, to some extent, halachic backgrounds. When I say to some extent, that doesn't mean necessarily that people are machmir on everything, but I think the liberal denominations of Jewry just didn't develop the same way, as you know. They didn't develop the same way in Israel as they developed here. And the backbone of what we're doing in Israel is really connected to a lot of more sort of like orthodox interpretations or understandings of our tradition. A lot of the things, though, that we're interested in is thinking about what are the sentiments that we take for granted in Israel, which perhaps create challenges in light of the fact that we have power. And because I want this to be something which is engaging to the people here, I want to point out things which maybe all of us take for granted, but I think are hyper problematic, both from a religious perspective and also from a political perspective. So the first thing that I would want to point out is the notion of permanency of Jewish majority, or the notion that there needs to be some sort of Jewish exclusivity over the land of Israel. I think it's something that's deeply ingrained in our understanding of ourselves and of our community. completely not necessary if you think of articulations of nationalisms, and also very religious because the word permanent is there. And I think anytime you hear permanent, there's an element of theology there. If we were to say to ourselves, we need a majority for now because there's no, because we have enemies and we need to protect ourselves, that would be one thing. But when we say Jews will always need to be a majority in the land because there will always be attacks on us, because there's something ingrained in the relationship between us and the non-Jew. So that means that there's a self-understanding of our region, which I think creates a lot of theological problems. In addition to that would be an understanding of time. We all understand or self-understand that we were 2,000 years in exile, and now we've returned to our land after 2,000 years. That's not something Smotrich made up, and even not Ben Gvir, but I think that's a self-understanding. Because we're critical historically here, so it's okay to say that we haven't been in exile for 2,000 years, because the Romans don't exile. It's just not something that happened 2,000 years ago. It's a myth which we created in terms of our self-understanding. But what it really does is create a theology of return, which really creates a lot of challenges in the way we understand our tradition and in the way we understand the relationship to our land. I'm pointing out sort of critical areas, but I'm going to present an alternative as somebody who lives in Israel and is happy living in Israel and wants his kids to live in Israel and all of that stuff, if this is being recorded, and also if it isn't. But we have this understanding of a finality, of a process. First of all, which creates a lot of anxiety, because what happens if the project, a weird word for a state, if the project fails, and what happens if we're exiled again, or what happens if we leave? It takes a different sort of understanding in terms of our understanding of our community. More importantly, it also points to this notion of exclusivity. The idea that it's ours because we return to it, and the idea is that it's not theirs because they're not part of their narrative. The third function that I want to focus on, which I think is problematic in our context, is the notion of compromise. I grew up in sort of like the peace camp world, and the story was the right isn't willing to compromise. We're willing to create painful compromises. It's a story that I imagine a lot of you know. The problem with the word compromise is that it works so long that there's an ability to compromise. What happens is when violence erupts and you can't compromise, you revert to your original non-compromising position. And if your non-compromising position is the opposite of sharing the land, so your position reverts to exclusivity. Exclusivity, when I say exclusivity, it's another way for me of saying supremacy. I think a lot of times we talk justifiably about the problems of self-understanding of Jewish supremacy, but I think that stems in the notion of exclusivity, meaning the idea that this is ours and ours only, or ours in a way that isn't somebody else's. So what does one do in this context? In the Shmol Emuni's context, I think a lot of what we focus on is what does it mean from a religious perspective to, on one hand, hold on to political sovereignty, but on the other hand, understand that we are religiously in exile. In a way, this isn't new at all. It's actually even quite boring for anybody who reads a Siddur. I live in Jerusalem, and every day I say Techazena Einenu Shuvcha LeTzion, as if I'm in exile because I'm in exile. I think that understanding allows for a relationship with land, which is different, and it allows for an anxiety, which is different. The anxiety really is the notion that if I fail to behave in a certain way, I won't be able to connect to the land. but it's not premised on questions of sovereignty. It's premised on questions of behavior. All of this you can ask questions about after if I'm saying things which are a bit amorphous. And also you can ask questions about other stuff if you don't care about this stuff. What that means is that when we say during Shema, Vayayim Shema, and we talk about what it means that if we don't behave well, that the land will spit us out, it's really not a question of sovereignty. It's a question of how does one behave in the land of Israel, which is like the quintessential exile from a religious perspective and from an ethical perspective. In that sense, I think we're holders on a mainstream rabbinic tradition. It's the tradition of Tzfat, of the Kabbalists of Tzfat. It's a tradition of the Shlah. It's a tradition of the Akedat Yitzchak. I would argue that it's the tradition of Yehuda Levi. I think it's the notion is that Israel represents the place where we need to be most holy and therefore most anxious. So if we want to imagine that, we can talk about a comparison to something that we all instinctively understand, which is the notion of Shabbat, that it's a notion where that day is most holy and therefore I'm most anxious, or I have the most anxiety of how to behave properly. The second issue, which is political, but I think is also theological in our sense, is that the starting point of any conversation of the left needs to be a binational starting point. Now, when I say binational, it's a terrible word because everybody starts thinking about sort of like a binational country, and then you have all sorts of questions like, what does that look like? And it's like a pipe dream, and na. I don't mean that. Although I won't sit Shiva if there's like a binational democracy, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is that there are two nations currently living in Israel. That's a starting point of any left conversation. That the land between the river and the sea is already binational, and Israel also under, even if we forgo the occupied territories in Gaza, Israel itself is also binational. That's a starting point of any political conversation. And the question needs to be, how do we recognize that binational nature of our land? Do we recognize it as a problem which needs to be fixed, in the sense that we wish it wasn't binational, but but we have no choice? Or do we recognize it as a problem that needs to be fixed in the sense that we recognize it's binational, and the problem is that the nations don't have equal access to dignity in our land? We choose a second option. It's not an option of compromise. It's not an issue of us saying we revert to our position of exclusivity when we don't have a choice, and when we do have a choice, by nature or by grace, we grant other people the dignity that we have, but rather that the focus on allowing for the dignity of the other is a fixing of a problem which existed from the get-go, which is that it's a binational premise. Now, for those of you in this conversation who are coming from the deeper left, obviously I recognize that there are a lot of challenges in what I said now regarding the history, regarding how people got to where they got, regarding colonial natures of things and so on. But currently I'm talking about like achshav, about the present. The present is binational in the country. And I think from the Smol Emuni's perspective, we want to dignify ourselves by dignifying the others who live on the land, out of an understanding that that is our moral and religious prerogative, or chiyuv. Chiyuv is, I'm translating all this in my head. Obligation, thank you. This is all translated in real time. Maybe I'll say one more thing about that, and then I don't know how many minutes I've spoken so far, but whatever. Maybe I'll say one more thing about that, just to put some Torah into it. I think the instinct of the liberal religious person, be they Orthodox or Reform or whatever or secular, is to say we have this understanding of the dignity of all human beings because She'adam nivra b'tzelem, right? The man was created in the image of God, and we appeal to that sentiment, and in a way, that moral sentiment is a sentiment of the Western world, and in a way we just predate that, and a lot of people have said that, of course, and there's, I imagine, an element, I don't know anything about history, but I imagine there's an element of the tradition which develops in that way. I've always had problems with that sentiment in the sense that it's not whole. If you read how the rabbis look at the notion of B'Tselem, it's usually, when we talk about Chaviv Adam Nivra B'Tselem in Masechet Avot, the sentence after that is Chaviv B'Miyuchad, the Jew. So you have an understanding of a human being as maybe more or higher up than the not human, a sentiment which I think is a problem in the 21st century for a lot of other reasons. Can we really say today about human beings that they are the greatest creation? I'm not sure. But I also think it creates a descriptive that's not necessarily prescriptive. And I think a lot of times, you'll definitely hear in Israeli discourse, and I imagine this is true in discourse all the world, is that somebody can come out of this, somebody can stop being in the image of God. So we'll have terrorists facing us, and they really do abysmal things, and then they go out of this notion of being in the image of God. And then what happens is that descriptive becomes a partial descriptive, and that partial descriptive is really your people, and not the barbarians at the gate. There's another Mishnah in Masechet Avot, which I like a lot, which is, there's a saying of things and their opposite. So it's Ezeu Gibo Kovesh et Yitzro, right? Who has courage? The person who holds on to his yetzer, instinct, desire. Ezeu Chacham, who is wise? He who learns from every human being. And the last one is Ezeu Mechubad, who is dignified. המכבד כל אדם. איזה מכובד המכבד את הבריות, right? I stopped with Adam because I knew that was המכבד את הבריות, who dignifies the created, all created. The notion of who is dignified, he who dignifies all who is created, is not only descriptive but rather prescriptive. And that understanding for me and for us in Small Emuni is that our humanity is created by the dignifying of others who have less dignity than us. And that is because, as the Mishnah continues, that God dignifies himself by dignifying us. So there's an understanding of hierarchy and privilege already embedded into that Mishnah. There's an understanding that there's not some sort of egalitarian equality that we're all just born into, but rather there are people who have less than us, or things or creatures that have less than us, and our lives are dignified by working with others. I say that because in the context of something like Bnei Avraham, and in light of everything I said right now, the question for us is not how to save the Palestinians. I don't think they need us to save them. But the question is, how do we behave as just human beings, as ethical human beings in a place where there are people who don't have dignity? So it's not just about being frustrated and being angry about hunger in Gaza. It's about our lives as Jews dedicated to feeding those who don't have food. It's not just about looking in frustration at settlers who are getting beaten up, or Palestinians who are getting beaten up by settlers. It's really about dignifying ourselves by providing the dignity that we can to the Palestinians next to us in the Holy Land. That's a bit about Small Emuni in terms of how we view what we're doing now. I want to say that just in sum, I'm not an optimistic person at all. But that doesn't mean, it's not like the occupation will end or that Bibi will be replaced or whatever. B'ezrat Hashem, b'mehera b'yameinu. It's not like that'll happen and like the Mashiach will come, right? There'll always be problems that we need to deal with. But I think there's a really wonderful and happy way to live if you're embedded in this type of work. And it's something that I think is very, when you meet with Smol Emuni people, it's very, for me, medabek. It's contagious. That you see a lot of people who just want to do this type of work. And I think what's being created right now, sort of back home for me, is this notion that we're not doing this because we don't have any other option. And then, God willing, we can stop doing this as soon as possible when things get back to normal. But rather, this is a good way to live. That doesn't, again, make you necessarily more optimistic, but it does make you less alienated from yourself. This notion that we wish we didn't have to protest, but we'll just get this over us and then we can go back to drinking our coffee, is something which creates a sense, I think, of alienation just in terms of your life, because you're not living the life you want to live. And the life that I want to live is a life of political activism in the way that I described. And I think that's part of the reason that Smol Emuni is developing the way it's developing. So that's a bit about like 4 introductions in terms of what we do, but I'd be happy to open up. And Esther, if you have questions, I don't know like how you want to do this. I'm fine with anything.
I can ask one question and then I can open it up. Well, thank you. I mean, I think I'm sure I'm not the only one to kind of express that gratitude for that kind of theology that we rarely hear. One that kind of sees reality as it actually is, the people on the land, the people that are less dignified. I would include our own, the ways we ourselves fall short, which is obviously part of being human. I think one of the things that's really has been interesting to me, and I think we've talked a little bit about, and I'm curious how you think about, is, I think either it was after the Israeli elections or maybe after Trump's election, I remember thinking to myself, okay, we're Jews. We're used to the fact that the people in power are not our friends. But it's harder when they're, your siblings' friends.
Yes.
So how do you think about just kind of the structures of sovereignty, but not just sovereignty as like a big theological word, but like actual Knesset members? I don't know, people who rule the land. Maybe I'll add to that, like one other little thought is that we once had someone over for Shabbat meal who was French. And I don't know, somehow during the conversations he said, we're in the Fifth Republic, whatever the French are. Fifth. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, so we've just started. We have time to come up with a better structure to govern. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Oh, I don't know. I think all, it's Rosh Hashanah's classics. All governments are bad governments, but I think, I think like communal relations there's always a gap. This is something, maybe this is more a critique of sort of our community, of like left communities, my community, in the sense that I don't know what if I join a minyan, I don't know what people believe in when they're davening. Like I don't. It doesn't matter to me that they believe in the same sense of justice that I believe in. There's always going to be a gap, and there's always going to be friction between what you want and your community. The problem is when that community becomes political, and therefore that gap becomes much more political. So my problem, let's say, in going to shul, that people believe in other things is not necessarily that they believe in other things, but that they make the davening about that thing that they believe in. But if they didn't, I wouldn't mind I actually think there's something beautiful about the fact that, like, I imagine a very specific Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the person next to me imagines another Kadosh Baruch Hu, and we're davening the same prayer, and we can fight it out ideologically, but there's a sense of modesty or a sense of at least understanding of that friction in any communal context. I don't want to overly romanticize it. It's not fun being a child of a left-wing activist, let's say, for example, in a religious Zionist school, when they ask you, what do your parents do? And I don't want to romanticize that feeling of, one of my daughters, she always says to me, what can I say that's the most boring response that will elicit no question? And of course, that's a CEO in an educational organization. So I don't want to romanticize that feeling of loneliness, which creates also the small emuni to begin with. But I also don't want to. I don't think we're trying to replicate where we felt alienated from, just in our own sort of direction, but rather point back to sort of a world of ritual which isn't necessarily sincere all of the time. And I think that's really important, that there's a lack of sincerity. I'll explain. And this is not my idea, but I was reading this book recently. It's really been, a lot of our like Macomb folks have been reading it, which came out I think in 2007 or 8, by a professor. He's one of the writers, Adam Seligman, in Boston University, on ritual and its consequences. But a lot of the focus has been, I've just been talking about it because I think it's really important in our context. A lot of the focus there is that ritual, be it like praying or be it like saying to somebody, how are you, and them saying fine, is not really about the world as it is. It's about the world as it should be. And sincerity is about the world as it really, really is. And the argument in that book is that in the world that we live, in every society, there's a tension between those two things. But in the world we live, there's really a leaning into sincerity and not enough into ritual. So we're always focused on the meaning of things. What does it mean when we say this? Does it really mean what I really, really believe that it means? And I think part of the way sort of religious communities function is that you don't always say what you really mean or what you really believe. And I think you say how the world should function. We get this a lot when we say to somebody, how are you? I imagine this is true in the Trump era as well. When you ask people, how are you doing? Oh, personally, I'm fine. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking to pretend of how the world should be. From the perspective of how I want to live, I want to live a less ideological world. Like I want to live in a world where people pray for different things in the same language that I do. To your direct question, but for me it's connected. I really like the school that I send my children to, even though most of their teachers vote for Ben Gvir, which drives me crazy. But simultaneously, they really love my children, and they really want them to have the best day that they can. And I'm thankful to them. And I think that's something that's complicated, and that's just how the world works. So I think basically what I'm trying to say is that I think being a minority position in a community also gives you a great amount of understanding of the world and not just frustration. We can hold on to that without. I spend most of my time fighting Ben Gvir. Everything's fine. But we can also hold on to that fact that sometimes we hear something from somebody that we really disagree with, and that's okay. Yeah.
We have a lot of experience.
Yes.
Minorities. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I see there's already some questions.
Yeah. So let me think.
How do you
Can
want
the
to do
people on Zoom hear me on this mic?
it?
Yes?
How are we going to feel this? Oh, you can feel it. Perfect. Hi.
Thank you so much for coming all
Sure.
the way here and speaking with us. My question is, Something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I would love to hear your perspective, is as an American Jew who, wants to learn about Israel and cares deeply about what happens there, but at the same time is like apprehensive about like imposing my own agenda on what happens there, and wants to like center, the perspective of like Israelis and Palestinians who actually do live there, and not like impose my own agenda. Like, how do you, as like an Israeli activist, like what advice would you give to like American Jews who want to learn about what happens in Israel without like sort of imposing like their own agenda on it, if that makes sense?
I think the way you articulated the question means that there's not really a problem in the question. I think if it's really about recognizing the fact that the local actors on the ground are perceiving things in a way, or maybe they're the political actors who are the primary political forces in sort of reshaping the country, and the question is how to learn of that. I think there's a lot there. Of course, you can learn through sort of what we're doing and what other folks are doing. And I think Smolim in the U.S., I see like the lecture series and the people coming over here, and I think I think that's a great, both Jews and Palestinians. I think that's a really important and great way to learn. But I also want to say that we also have a subjective perspective, and there are a lot of things that we don't see as well. And I definitely felt that during the war, that there were a lot of times that part of the anger, the frustration, the disconnect was real, but I think it was based on the fact that we were feeling a lot of things that you can't feel from the outside, but you were seeing a lot of things that we can't see from the inside, if that makes sense. And I think that creates a lot of friction, but it also is very natural. Like, it's natural. Like, war can be like clearly wrong and also complicated from the individual's perspective, because the set of decisions one needs to make in light of something which is right or wrong, like, is not connected to whether it's right or wrong, if that makes sense. Like, because you're constantly negotiating a reality which you didn't choose, and I think that sort of confuses or obfuscates a lot of how we saw things. And there was a lot of frustration, or a lot of how we see things. There's a lot of frustration from, like, let's say, critical American Jews saying, how come Israelis don't see things a certain way, which I recognize and I understand. So I would argue that it's important, I think, to hear what we're doing and what we're saying, but it's also important to hold on to the external position, which we don't necessarily see, or to an external position which we can't necessarily respond to. As you know, for example, your country is heavily involved in the creation and the perpetuation of the situation in our country, in our whatever, in our land, and I think as for you, I am as an American citizen, you need to do everything in your power to change that sort of understanding. But I think you would recognize immediately that can't be and shouldn't be my fight. So we're already in different positions. We just need to be able to have an honest conversation about it, recognizing that different people have different sort of political imperatives in the same context. And I think if we look at each other equally, it's not that hard to do. Surprisingly, nobody does it, but it's still, it's possible. Maybe it is hard to do, but it's possible. Yeah.
Instead of using the mic, my mother is holding up a card that says "Can't hear the questions."
So we'll just say the questions.
Yeah,
Sure.
if you could repeat them, that would be great.
So I was simultaneously arguing a little troubled by your statements today, because I
That's
feel
okay.
like you crossed the watershed moment. I feel like what you were talking about with Israel is very aspirational, and I feel like as of today, the aspirational era for Israel has ended, because now we're in the era of real politics. Netanyahu has screwed up everything. We're in a disaster. Israel is perceived by America. What's the question?
If it could just be a statement and not a question, that would be.
Fine, thank you. It's a political organization. You're allowed to make statements.
Everything's good, yeah.
Netanyahu has messed up Iran policy and America. Americans are turning against Israel like a tsunami.
Okay.
And I think Smol and Muni might be the only chance to recover the dialogue that would be positive in regards to Israel. And I'm wondering if you perceive the same foreign policy crisis and how we would respond to it.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question, well, there were a bunch of components in the question, but part of it is about sort of the realpolitik versus the aspirational aspect. I hope I wasn't aspirational, at least in the, like I was aspirational in the messianic sense, not in the aspirational Zionism sense, but I recognize what you mean. But also I think the question was about sort of how do we create an alternative which is related to policy in terms of how Israel is perceived in the world and so on and so forth. Look, I'm not, I want to be very sort of honest. I think like Smol Emuni is an incredibly ambitious project, but also, there's a saying in our parts, which is there are people who who sow wheat and there are people who plant trees. And you need to recognize, and I was also saying this from a policy perspective, you need to recognize that there are things which have immediate sort of benefits and things which take time. I'm not interested primarily in the American-Israeli relationship and in what it does to both to either benefit or harm the world. I know I know things. We're not trying to revive something that was lost. I obviously think incredibly negative things about Netanyahu, but I also recognize that the problem in many senses is deeper than Netanyahu, and this isn't going to be a quick fix. It's not like if God willing, if there's another government, we need another government immediately because the people in this government are killing a lot of people. But that doesn't mean that problems are going to be solved. And I'm conscious of that, not because I'm aspirational and not because I'm starry-eyed, but rather I need to create a story for myself and for the activists around me, which needs to sustain them for the next X amount of years. And I don't want to create something. I think a lot of times, and I say this from also my own personal history, we put a line where we say, this is it. This is the most important thing. Like if we don't win the next election, all is lost. Sometimes we lose the next election, and we have a whole bunch of activists and the world around them who leave the sphere because we told them. It's like when they said the door is closing on the two-state solution. The door is closing on the. At some point, somebody's going to say, okay, has it closed already? So we create these narratives of like immediate anxiety, and that even if they're solved, like clearly we're going to have a right-wing government next. Even if Netanyahu loses, we're going to have a right-wing government. And we need to be honest. The reason we're going to have a right-wing government is because most Israelis currently are on the right. So obviously, politics, realpolitik. So politics are incremental. I want a bit more that way and a bit less that way. And I'm very involved in politics, and a lot of our people are very involved in politics. They're parliament members who self-identify as Smol Emuni. So it's Naama Lazimi identifies as Smol Emuni. Her husband is publishing a book with us in a couple of months. Gilad Kariv identifies as Smol Emuni. We're very embraced by mainstream political players. Some of them to the left of us, and some of them to the right of us, and that's fine. But I'm also. We need to pick up the phone at the end of the day of an activist who got beat up by a settler and was then told by the military to go home in a situation which is so clear-cut morally, and if they call us and say, how should I feel about this and why should I go back, I don't want to lie to them and tell them that we can solve this tomorrow. And I think that's why I stress the fact that this is about politics as a way of life, and on the realpolitik side, some sort of incremental. After these last 7 years or 8 years, which started with COVID and ended with Iran, how can we say a sentence like, we need to get things back on track? Like, clearly we need some sort of modesty regarding the world as it's sort of like falling apart. And for me, it's not some sort of like moralistic I just want to do the right thing. Obviously, we choose point A and not choose point B because we think A is more effective than B. But I also, I just don't know. And I'm also as I'm sure you know, there's no group that's less romantic about its size than sort of the left-wing religious group. So I also recognize sort of like our role in this, Yeah.
Thank you. I want to take one from the Zoom, and then we'll go back to some people here. Okay, this is mamash politics. What do you think of the new political party formed by the leaders of Omdim B'Yachad, standing together? The standing together leadership.
It was a very well-articulated question because it's not standing together, but rather a party formed by the leadership of standing together.
Benjamin, is this your question? Benjamin, is this your question?
Look, I will give, for that very political question, I'll give a very political answer, which is, first of all, the folks, a lot of the leadership are standing together are very, very close to Omdim B'Yachad, to Smol Emuni. Omdim B'Yachad is a grassroots movement which grew quite a bit in the last couple of years, and their leadership just joined a political party, formed a political party. I would say on the positive that there are at least 4 parties that I can think of right now, and anybody can imagine what those parties are, including the new party, where I'm really excited about sort of the candidates who are running. And I think, and I imagine other people in Smol Emuni would have another 4 parties, but that's already a lot of parties. Maybe 5 parties now that I'm thinking about it. I think that there's a lot of realpolitik criticism of the Omdim B'Yachad move because it's taking away votes. They don't know if it will pass threshold. I think the overarching agenda, which is serious people going into politics, should be something that any left-wing activist is happy with. I'm sure a lot of Smol Emuni people will vote for an Omdim B'Yachad platform, just like a lot of Smol Emuni people will vote for the Democrats, just like some will vote for Ram, some will vote for Chadash and Balad, some won't vote. I imagine some will vote for Eisenkot. We have a pretty wide range of political positions, but I can say very honestly that also in all the parties that I mentioned, I think there's some really, really good people. So that's my sort of answer to that. I think it's great, but we're not sort of like solely connected to them. But we're definitely a lot of our activists. There's a lot of overlap. There you go. So just the other 2.
Yeah. First of all, I heard the B'nai Abraham on Monday, and I was like so impressed with what they're doing.
Yay.
I've heard of that piece before, so I'm really excited about that part. But you talked about curriculum, and I didn't catch the Hebrew word that you called it. But who are you reaching out to? Who is integrating that curriculum at all? I mean, is it in yeshivot at all? Is it in Tali schools? Where is it being integrated? And does it reach any of the U.S. and other diaspora kids who are doing their gap years? Because it can bring that information back to their communities and maybe a better understanding of what also.
So Esther will say a couple of words about the about the Smol Emuni U.S. gap year program, but I'll say about Israel. First of all, I want to recognize that like Hasadeh is an organization which is a year old, and curriculum takes time both to develop and also to integrate. But I will say, like in every project of the Smol Emuni, when we start something, the immediate response is, there are only going to be 5 of you. And every time it's wrong, by tens and tens of percent. I think we've sort of educated ourselves that the only way to affect, as sort of people who are religious and on the left, we've educated ourselves for a couple of decades that the only way to affect change is to take a moderate right position. Like to have some sort of negotiation with the radical right, and maybe we can push them to the more moderate position. First, I'm not interested in moderacy, like politically. I don't understand the notion that I don't even. I think we need to behave with each other moderately, but I don't understand what that means as politically. especially if you're a religious individual. I don't understand what that means to be moderate about. But when we started, we said we want to focus not on the curriculum, but on the teacher. And we have 150 teachers. And they're obviously Hasadeh, which is the name of the organization, is a less political organization. Well, I justifiably, I don't think you need to have an organization called Smol Emuni going to schools. Just like I don't think you should have an organization called Yamin Emuni going to schools. But I do think that humanistic perspective needs to go into the school system. So by way of example, we have a Shnat Sherut starting next year. A Shnat Sherut means a gap year, an Israeli full-year gap year program. It's preparatory to the military in the sense that people get drafted at the end. But for example, my daughter, she goes to Shnat Sherut of Bnei Akiva. If you're religious, the only option you have in Israel is Bnei Akiva. So is the Shnat Sherut competing with the 400 kids in Bnei Akiva next year? No, it's 9 kids. But I do know that there hasn't been a program like this for 40 years. And I definitely know that it's easier to get the next 9 than the first 9. And once you have 2 9s, it's easier to get the next 2. And I know that because I grew up in religious Zionist institutions. And anybody who's seen the stronghold of the hard religious right on religious Zionism in general knows that if you stick to educational platforms for long enough, you can affect real change. So that's the strategy. Maybe something about Gabriel?
Well, I'll just say a similar thing about some of the work we're trying to do here. First of all, the gap year students. So we started this year partly because my daughter was spending a year in Israel, and we started a fellowship for gap year students. We had 18 students from various programs who met twice a month. They did a variety of things. The first half of it was a Friday. Fridays they have off. The first half of the year they mostly were in a Beit Midrash, learned some kind of Torah, as well as heard from peace activists and historians and politicians. And then the second half of the year we did, Shabbat starts later, and we were able to do a series of tours, really learning about kind of the history in a different way. So a dual narrative tour of Yaffo, where they hear the Israeli Jewish perspective and the Palestinian perspective. A tour in Jerusalem where they saw some of the demolition of Palestinian homes, and a meeting with, for example, with students in a Palestinian-Israeli gap year program, kids their same age that also take a year off before going to Israeli colleges, and got to spend a morning with them. And we're going to try to have a little bit more interaction with that group next year, because it was really the first opportunity for these kids, American Jewish kids from religious backgrounds, to meet with kids the same age who have this other experience. And a little bit similar to what Mikhael was saying about the education program, I think we've discovered here a similar thing. We don't really need to, I mean, we obviously want to convince people, but that's not our main mode of operating. There are a lot of people out there who have been deeply troubled by the types of things they hear in their shuls, schools, JCCs, the kind of lack of complexity in the conversation, the kind of repression of a lot of things that we know are happening, a very one-sided story of history. And once you give an opportunity to come and hear these other voices, there are really a lot of people who are interested. And so we've only started a little bit over a year ago. And, you know, before our first conference on March 2025, we had about, 200 people on our mailing list. We're now close to 7,000. So there are people out there looking for that. And similarly, we have a group of rabbis who meet once a month, congregational rabbis. We have a group of educators that have done a semester process. And so I think when there's a community and a language in which to address some of this, there's an audience for it. And I think that's a similar thing to what Mikhael is saying. I think there are a lot more of us than we realize. Maybe we'll take one more question. Oh, sorry.
Can we take like 3 in a row?
Oh, sure. Let's take 3 in a row. Ami, Abby, and I don't know your name. I know, but he always asks questions in our events. I know you too well.
If you want to get a question.
One question.
Real quick. I will be quick. As far as the settlers attacking the Palestinian farmers, whatever, what about the Israeli army? Are they complicit with them?
Okay.
Let it stop it. And two, do you consider yourself a Zionist?
Okay.
Okay, let's take the two others or three others.
Based on, because there's certain things
Yeah.
that you said along the way.
Yeah.
Abby, Ami, and
Jeremy,
So,
thank you.
sure.
Sit.
Thank you, first of all. I did not expect to be immersed in theology tonight, so that was
Oh, good.
Yeah,
You know what, let's-
there's a lot I think I didn't understand and have questions about, but I often have a question about, and I think it's related, is how
And he's called the-
you or people you know dialogue with either family members, community.
Okay.
Blah.
So I'll say, so far we have questions of complicity, military, we have questions about my Zionism, and we have questions about dialogue with family. Okay.
I love talking about small money and I love explaining it to people. And one thing that I've realized is I'm not very good at explaining it to people. And I wonder actually for both of you, is there an analogy or is there an analog of another movement that you feel like mirrors anywhere in the world, anything? It feels like it mirrors and echoes what you're trying to do for both of you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so about what maybe what organizations or what movements or streams of thought are similar to how we think of things, so in order to also explain to ourselves or
And sort of outcomes oriented.
outcome, yeah.
I spent some time in Israel and Palestine in last winter doing work in the Sarai and in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And to get to this thing, I thought it was so clear the complicity of the army and the
Yeah.
settlers, taking orders from the settlers and
Yeah.
whatnot. And also in Jerusalem, seeing Ben Gvir or Kahani stickers on every other street pole and stuff. And so, to the extent that like the far right, as it were, has sort of become mainstream in Israel, how do you? You said you feel good about living in Israel. You want your kids to live in Israel. Presumably, you feel fine about paying taxes in Israel. I'm just like curious how you think about that. And
So am I a Zionist? I'm just kidding. I'll do my best to try to answer all those questions. No, I mean, yeah, and in the most honest way possible. So, I mean, regarding the relationship with families, I think it depends on the person. I'm very, I guess I could say, fortunate. I'm not rebellious in any regard to my parents. If anything, I'm a bit more of a moderate, which is sort of, if you've heard me up until now, you can imagine what my parents are. Also, both religiously and politically. But there are people who obviously, a majority of our activists don't come from necessarily supportive families. I will say one thing that I've noticed, which is very sort of interesting for me, that there's very little alienation from the family, and you'll hear this a lot from our activists, that they'll say they were raised in conditions where they didn't see certain things, and they're frustrated with their family that their families didn't see certain things. But once their eyes were open to that certain thing which they didn't see, the Palestinians, they use the education that they got to sort of reorient themselves. So it's not there's not much of a rebellion language in Smol Emuni, and there's not much of Nikur is alienation, right? Yeah. So there's the estrangement from family. Obviously, there are difficult conversations at home and so on. But I think you'll hear a lot from our activists that they think that if their parents understood what they understood, they'd be proud of them, and not that it's sort of like a pushback. And I think that's something that is really important in Israel in general, particularly in Israel, which is so far right now, is not to be estranged from most of Israeli society, and to recognize, I mean, I would call it tshuva, other people would call it other things, but people change and situations change. And I think I talk with the people that I live with. And in that context, I think the most radical thing to do in Israel right now is to just see things as they are. Because so much is sort of you're blinded from, like purposely. And I think also we need to recognize, and you definitely know that, and I'm going to respond to all the questions, but you definitely, you know this because you were there, that Israelis are under immense psychological stress, some of it which is really being directed like officially by like the state, and there have been articles about this and so on. So I think we need some like rachmanis towards like that, towards Israelis themselves who are going through not only sort of objective trauma, but also like incredible like political and psychological trauma dictated by a lot of different sort of forces, and not in the sort of like conspiratory way, just in the very sort of obvious way. I'm not happy like about where the country is and where the country is going, but it's where I live, and I don't think that if you live somewhere else, you're sort of excused from dealing with all the terrible things happening where you live. It's where my people are, and it's where my fight is, and it's where I want to be. And from my perspective, I think the primary Jewish question of this era is Jewish treatment of Palestinians from a perspective of power. And I'd rather be on the front line of that question than sort of be somewhere else. And that's not as a judgment of somebody for us, but that's in terms of my opinion. And within that, also recognize sort of all the positive elements of what it means to be home. That doesn't mean that I'm in less frustrated or less critical. It just means that, you know, that's sort of like the life which I'm sort of interested in being. And I do think you notice something very different, that like I live in multiple political spheres, and you hear a lot in like the liberal left, like if Bibi gets elected, if this we're leaving. And you don't hear that too much in Smol Emuni. It has a lot to do with sociology. It has a lot to do with who has dual passports and who doesn't have dual passports. It has a lot to do with options abroad and not options abroad. And we need to remember that if we leave, that's also a problem. Like it's not like if everybody leaves, something will be solved. It just somebody else will need to deal with these problems the way that we're dealing with them. So from my perspective, and I also think, for me, it's a wonderful thing as a Jew to live in Jerusalem. Like that's where the Shekhinah is, supposedly. Regarding complicity, yes. And regarding and I think you see that more. There's it wasn't translated to English, unfortunately, but there's an hour because everything's falling apart. They're not being court-martialed because and this is why I think even if there's another government, B'ezras Hashem, it's going to be still challenged. From the lowest position on the ground to the highest position in government, everything is oriented against the Palestinians in also sort of like in a non-official way. So there are a lot of people with guns who are giving orders and taking orders who are not soldiers, or who are not officially soldiers. And a friend of mine told me yesterday that one of the distinctions between authoritarianism and fascism is who has the ability to hold a gun and who doesn't. So I know, but I want to answer everybody, so I'm just going to answer. So there's a lot to study about this and a lot to learn about this, and thankfully I think the international press is writing about it more in recent weeks, and I have a feeling in coming months more, because it's become a central issue in Israel, and then I know how this sort of develops. But we have a serious challenge in terms of how violence is perpetrated by state and by non-state actors in Israel. As to look, if I may, it's a very non-Israeli question to ask somebody about. We don't really talk about Zionism that much in Israel. I understand why people talk about it outside of the country. Okay, because always when I go there, so are you this or I'll say the following. I know that regarding my positions, most Israelis would say those are non-Zionist positions. I also.
Are you Zionist in the Herzl way?
Why would I want to be a Zionist in the Herzl way? The guy changed his opinion 20 million times. Why? There are. I'll tell you what I am. I am a, I am a, I am an Israeli. I'm an Israeli citizen who's happy with his Israeli citizenship, who pays taxes, who's gone to the army, who sends his kids to state-sponsored education, and who wants them to stay where he raised them, primarily because he wants to live next to his children and grandchildren. I also think that Palestinians need to have the right of return. I also believe that we can create a self-governing system which doesn't rely only on majority. And I would say that in this extremely Zionist position and extremely anti-Zionist position simultaneously. And I think that's the limitation of the conversation, because what happens is that the construct has changed very much from self-determination to a type of self-determination which requires ethnic supremacy. Obviously, I'm against ethnic supremacy, and I want to continue living where I am.
You answered my question.
Okay.
According to the definition of Zionism that we have now, you're a non-Zionist.
So when Zionist God meets me in Zionist heaven, I'll have a Zionist problem. Now regarding, but yeah, but you know, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Thank you. Now I do want to cut. No, for me it is important. Listen, sir. You don't live in my country. Wait. Now I speak. Now I speak. You don't live in my country. There is something incredibly condescending about telling somebody who lives in a certain area and pays heavy prices to sort of judge them in this perspective from a very, very specific point of view, which, as you also know, is partial. So the reason I don't want to identify myself for a certain person is because I don't want to play this game. But I do know that what is important for me is to affect change where I live. And I don't care what Herzl would say about that, because Herzl said a lot of things that I don't believe in, primarily about my God. So from my perspective, it's not really relevant to my life. What I would suggest for moving the conversation ahead is to less focus on late 19th century understandings of ideology and more focus on how we can move things ahead in a healthy way. Regarding sort of organizations or movements that I'm inspired, I feel that we're inspired by everything. But I would say the things that I care about deeply in terms of organizationally, obviously I'm interested in faith-based movements, which like liberation theology interests a lot of us. I would say some self-reflective Salafi movements I think are really important. Not obviously like the more jihadist Salafi movement, but Salafi movements which are more focused on quietism, I think are really relevant and I think are really important politically. And in that also Sufi movements, primarily in sort of northern Syria, sort of things that I care about more in terms of how I think about politics. I think interestingly, there has been, because I've looked for this, there have been little to no work that I know of done of like comparative projects on sort of like justice-oriented religious movements which are not going through a Protestant lens. And I think that has a lot to do with a lot of sort of the way academia works. But I would be very happy to read more. You like look for things like, I don't know, like in South Africa or in Syria or in northern India or things like that, because I'm like a frum individual and I care about like frum things. But I would also say that like, it also goes backwards a lot for us in the sense that some I don't. I have an American father and I lived here for a couple of years, but I don't understand this place that much, and I don't understand the politics of this place so much. So it's hard for me to sort of recognize like I think that this country is so extraordinary for me that there are things which are of inspiration, but less of understanding. But some yes, but I would say I wouldn't say that's necessarily where the ear goes to, just because this place is so powerful. But I do think that most of the stuff that we read and care about is internal, I think I don't know if that's a positive or negative, but so a lot of our folks are interested in specific types of Brit Shalom models, more Rabbi Binyamin, Bergman for sure, Sholem at specific times, things like that. Walter Benjamin, of course. That's sort of like the 20th century stuff. Our Rebbe, all of us in Small Muni, is Amnon Resker Kotzkin, for sure, one of like a serious thinker that we're all very sort of connected to and inspired by. But also, I think, and this does have to do with also the liberal tradition and the non-liberal tradition that I think a lot of us, maybe I'll end with this, that I think the role in the past of the religious Jew in the liberal period was that you had like liberals arguing for normalcy, and the religious Jew like put a verse at the end of that. So we would say, you know, like everybody needs equality, and then the religious individual, for like the generation before me, would say, and it also says Adam Nifra B'Tselem. And I think that was sort of like the relationship between sort of like normal people and religious normal people. But now it's like an abnormal time. So there's no sort of like premise where things go back to normal. So it doesn't make sense to be a normal religious person sticking a pasuk at the end of some sort of normalcy, because everything is sort of abnormal. So I think our role is to not try to sort of give a footnote to the secular liberal perspective, but to quote Binyamin, to sort of, you know, create a real state of exception to better our fight against fascism. And I think from that perspective, we use all the tools that we can to think about how God wants us to behave in the world. And for those of you who were into what I said in the last couple sentences, that was for you. And for those of you who had no idea what I was talking about, that's fine. It's okay. So that's, I guess, that. I mean, thank you so much. I'm sorry. I hope I just like your energy, so I wanted to respond in the same kind.
I appreciate that.
There you go. And thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mikhael. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Yeah, not much more to say. Thank you for being here. I'm happy to continue this conversation a little bit more. And then we should give Sally back her home. And again, she's not right here. But Sally, thank you for always opening your home to us. And thank you to our tech team as well. Sorry. Oh, come on. Come. Lucia, come over. Make the pitch.
Okay. Well, we have been raising funds this month for B'nai Avraham, the organization that Rabbi Manekin started or heads. And when I was talking to one of their activists, he told me that every penny, every dollar that they get goes directly to the logistics of bringing people out into the West Bank. So they actually are overwhelmed by the demand the demand of people who want to volunteer, but they don't have the funds to pay for the transportation and everything involved. They have to bring food for some things, since they're keeping kosher if they're staying for Shabbat. So I hope that everybody here can, if they can, help us help them, and we'll send out the link, and you can also send out the link to anybody else you think might be able to contribute. And we appreciate all of your contributions and your being here today and your support.